tea started like any ordinary babysitting job. I had agreed to watch his kids for a few hours while he attended to some work, expecting the usual chaos of toys scattered across the floor, the endless chatter of little voices, and the exhausting but familiar routine of feeding, entertaining, and calming down energetic children. The house was warm and inviting, a cozy haven filled with soft sunlight that streamed through the large windows, casting gentle patterns across the wooden floor. I remember the first time I saw him clearly. He was leaning casually against the doorway, arms crossed, observing the scene with a calm, confident air that immediately made me slightly nervous. There was something about the way he carried himself, older, composed, a quiet magnetism, that made him impossible to ignore. While I had come to care for his children, I couldn't help but notice him. Even in the midst of toys, squeals, and the endless chatter of little ones, he somehow dominated the room. Our first interaction was brief. A polite greeting, a nod, a small smile. Yet, in those few seconds, there was a spark of tension, an unspoken awareness that lingered between us. I tried to focus on the kids, on stacking blocks and playing pretend, but my eyes kept flicking back to him. The children laughed, running in and out of the living room, blissfully unaware of the subtle shift in the adult energy around them. He watched me with a calm intensity, like someone evaluating a painting. Not just the strokes, but the emotions hidden in the colors. Despite the chaos, there was a strange ease in the air. He didn't hover or micromanage. He simply observed, confident that everything was under control. And yet, I felt an unusual pressure, a subtle tension that wasn't there before. The more I tried to focus on my duties, the more I noticed him. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the casual tilt of his head, the effortless way he seemed to command attention without saying a word. I realized then that my calm, ordinary afternoon had shifted into something more complicated, something that pulled at my focus and peace in a way I hadn't anticipated. By the time he excused himself to leave, I found myself standing a little straighter, heart racing more than it should have, aware that even this casual meeting had left an imprint on me. What was supposed to be a straightforward babysitting job had already begun to blur the lines between professional responsibility and personal distraction. And I had only met him for a few minutes. That day, I learned an important truth. Sometimes, it's not the children who disrupt your peace. It's the adults standing quietly in the doorway, impossible to ignore, and somehow, unexpectedly, impossible to forget. The first few minutes of babysitting his kids had gone smoothly enough. I had anticipated the usual chaos of a living room scattered with toys, the constant chatter of children, and the need to keep them engaged and entertained. But nothing had prepared me for the subtle shift in the atmosphere the moment he stepped into the room. He didn't rush in or announce his presence loudly. Instead, he entered with quiet confidence, moving with a grace that seemed entirely natural. He watched me from across the room as I knelt on the floor, helping the children build a tower of colorful blocks. There was an intensity in his gaze that I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just curiosity or casual observation. It was something deeper, something that made me suddenly aware of myself in a way I hadn't expected. My focus on the kids faltered for just a second, then another, and before I knew it, I was stealing glances back at him while pretending to arrange the toys. The children were oblivious to the subtle tension growing between the two of us. They laughed and ran around, their energy infectious, but only heightened my awareness of him. He leaned casually against the doorway, arms crossed, the corner of his mouth hinting at a smile that seemed both playful and knowing. There was an ease in his posture that contrasted sharply with my own nervous energy. I was here to care for his children, to maintain a calm and composed demeanor, yet he had a way of quietly commanding the room that made my heart race just a little faster than usual. When he finally spoke, it was with a calm, measured tone. "They like you," he said, as if it were a statement and a question all at once. I smiled politely, brushing off the subtle flutter his words caused. "I hope so," I replied, kneeling down to offer the youngest a toy. But even as I did, his gaze lingered on me, and I felt an inexplicable tension settle in my chest. There was something disarming about the way he observed me, like he was noticing the little details that usually go unnoticed, the way I moved, the slight hesitation in my voice, the subtle adjustments I made to keep the children happy. It was flattering in a confusing sort of way and a little unsettling too. I was supposed to be the professional, the one in control of the situation, yet I suddenly realized that my thoughts were drifting, my attention pulled in ways I hadn't intended. By the time he left for a short meeting downstairs, I found myself adjusting the children's toys more slowly, my mind still replaying his calm smile and the subtle charm he exuded effortlessly. My first impression of him, quiet, confident, unassuming yet impossible to ignore, had already begun to make its mark. It was clear that this wasn't just another babysitting job. Something had shifted, something that promised to linger far longer than the afternoon light streaming through the windows. In that brief encounter, I understood that first impressions are not just fleeting moments. They are powerful, unpredictable forces capable of pulling at the edges of your peace before you even realize it. And he had done just that. The afternoon had been going smoothly, or at least that's what I had thought. The kids were happily engaged in their imaginative play, blocks and stuffed animals scattered around the living room, their laughter filling the warm, sunlit space. I was just beginning to feel a sense of rhythm in managing their energy when he appeared again, this time with a purpose that immediately made the air feel heavier. He walked in quietly, but with a presence that somehow dominated the room. There was no overt confrontation, no raised voice, nothing dramatic, but the subtle intensity in his eyes made my stomach tighten. He didn't need to speak to command attention. Just being there altered the dynamics entirely. I felt my back straighten and my hands fidget slightly as I tried to maintain focus on the children, arranging their toys and encouraging them to take turns. When he finally spoke, it was about something simple, the schedule for the kids, a reminder of a play date, instructions on snacks. But even in those ordinary words, there was a weight I couldn't ignore. His tone was calm and measured, yet it carried a sense of authority that made me feel simultaneously seen and scrutinized. Every gesture I made, every small correction I offered the children, suddenly seemed under review. I realized, with a flush rising to my cheeks, that I was not just babysitting children today. I was navigating the subtle, unspoken expectations of their father. The children, blissfully unaware of the tension, continued their laughter and play. I tried to focus on them, to let their energy ground me, but it was impossible to ignore the man standing quietly nearby. There was a strange duality in the moment. He was present, yet non-intrusive, confident, yet not overbearing. My own professional composure felt fragile, almost like a delicate vase teetering on the edge of a table. One wrong move, one misplaced word, and I feared the balance would shatter. What made the moment even more confusing was the undercurrent of attraction I felt, though I would never admit it aloud. He had a way of observing me that was both gentle and penetrating, a look that made me hyper-aware of myself, my posture, my words, even the way I smiled at the kids. The normal boundaries of a babysitter and parent relationship suddenly felt blurred, as if every interaction carried a hidden tension that neither of us dared to name. I caught myself stealing glances at him when I thought he wasn't looking, noticing the subtle movements, the slight tilt of his head, the faint curve of his lips, the casual confidence in his stance. It was maddening the way he disrupted my focus, my peace, and my professional poise without even trying. By the time he excused himself again, I was left with a strange mixture of relief and longing, my heart still racing from the silent intensity he had brought into the room. That tense moment, fleeting as it seemed, changed everything. I had come here to care for his children, to keep them safe and entertained, yet I left that encounter acutely aware that I was the one being subtly watched, evaluated, and stirred emotionally. Sometimes, it isn't the children who disrupt your peace. It's the quiet presence of someone who makes ordinary moments feel charged, unpredictable, and impossible to forget. The house had settled into a quiet rhythm by mid-afternoon. The children, momentarily content with a puzzle and coloring books, had drifted into a calm, playful silence that gave the living room a surprisingly serene atmosphere. It was in this unexpected pause that he approached me, not with authority, not with instructions, but with a gentle offer that made my heart skip: a cup of tea. I looked up from organizing the scattered crayons, unsure if he was serious. His calm, slightly amused expression hinted at a casual familiarity, a confidence that made my usual professional guard feel strangely inadequate. "Tea?" he asked softly, holding the steaming cup out toward me. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried a weight that I couldn't quite place. I hesitated, then nodded, feeling a flutter of nervous anticipation I hadn't expected. We settled on the sofa across from one another, a polite distance separating us. Yet somehow the space felt intimate. The golden afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting soft, warm patterns across the room. The children's laughter occasionally drifted in from the next room, a gentle reminder that our interaction was framed by their presence. But for those few quiet moments, it felt as though the world had narrowed down to just the two of us. Conversations started lightly about trivial matters, the kids' routines, favorite snacks, and little quirks. Yet beneath the casual words, there was an undercurrent of something more, a subtle tension neither of us seemed eager to name. Every glance, every slight smile, carried layers of unspoken curiosity and intrigue. I found myself laughing more easily than usual, drawn into the rhythm of his quiet charm, even as I reminded myself to stay professional. There was something intoxicating about his presence. It wasn't just his confidence or the way he seemed effortlessly at ease. It was the way he listened, truly listened, as if he was cataloging every word, every expression, every tiny movement. I realized that while I had come to his house to care for his children, he had, in these small, measured moments, begun to command my attention in ways that unsettled me. My focus wavered, my thoughts strayed, not toward the kids or the responsibilities of the afternoon, but toward him. I caught myself noticing details I hadn't before. The slight crinkle at the corner of his eyes when he smiled, the deep, calm tone of his voice, the subtle confidence in his posture. Ordinary gestures, a hand brushing back a strand of hair, a casual shift on the sofa, suddenly felt charged, intimate, and deliberate. For the first time that day, I felt my carefully maintained sense of control begin to crumble, replaced by a mix of curiosity and tension I couldn't easily ignore. By the time our tea was finished, the children had wandered back, giggling and tugging at our attention. Yet the effect of those quiet minutes lingered. A casual cup of tea, an ordinary pause in a busy afternoon, had shifted everything. He had managed, with effortless charm and quiet presence, to steal a fragment of my composure, leaving me aware that this babysitting job was no longer just about the children. It was about the undeniable, complicated pull of him. In that golden light, with the soft murmur of children's play behind us, I understood that sometimes the smallest gestures, the simple offering of tea, a shared laugh, a lingering glance, can carry the heaviest weight, stirring emotions you thought were safely tucked away. The living room was alive with energy. Blocks toppled, dolls were carried across the carpet, and the sound of tiny feet pattering against the floor created a rhythm that was both exhausting and infectious. I had grown accustomed to managing this kind of chaos in previous babysitting jobs, but today, something felt different. The usual whirl of activity seemed amplified by the presence of him. The way he watched quietly from the side, calm and composed amidst the storm of toys and laughter. I darted back and forth, picking up stray building blocks, redirecting little hands from squabbles over a toy, and encouraging the children to work together. My heart raced, not just from the physical effort, but from the awareness that he was observing every move I made. There was no criticism in his eyes, no harsh judgment, just a quiet, steady attention that somehow made me self-conscious. I caught myself glancing at him occasionally, and each time, our eyes met for just a fraction of a second before I quickly returned my focus to the children. The children's laughter was infectious, echoing through the house in waves of pure joy. They were blissfully unaware of the tension that had crept into the adult world around them. One of the little ones climbed onto my lap, demanding that I read a story, while another tugged insistently at his father's sleeve. He responded patiently, kneeling to their level, offering gentle words and small smiles. Watching him interact with his children, I couldn't help but notice how natural and effortless he was, so different from my own frazzled attempts to maintain order. Even amidst the chaos, there were moments when time seemed to slow. A brief exchange of glances between us, a raised eyebrow, a half-smile, was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I realized that while the children were the center of my attention, he had become the unexpected distraction. His presence carried a subtle tension, one that contrasted sharply with the carefree joy around us. I felt a mixture of admiration, curiosity, and something unspoken that made it impossible to focus entirely on my task. There were also moments of vulnerability in the chaos. A toy was dropped, a child cried briefly, and I found myself instinctively reaching to comfort them. He noticed, of course, and his look was one of quiet approval, the kind that made me feel both seen and exposed. I wondered if he understood how deeply I felt the pull between professionalism and the awareness of his effect on me. By the time the play session began to wind down, the room was a colorful mess of toys, laughter still lingering in the air. I sank onto the sofa for a brief moment of respite, watching him smile as he helped the children tidy up. I felt a strange combination of exhaustion and exhilaration. The chaos had reminded me of my role, of the responsibility I had undertaken, but had also highlighted the undeniable pull of his presence, the way he could unsettle, intrigue, and capture my attention, all without a word. In that whirlwind of energy and laughter, I realized something important. Sometimes it's not the chaos of children that disrupts your peace, but the quiet, composed figures standing at the edge of the room, watching, noticing, and subtly stealing fragments of your focus and heart. Today, he had done just that. The children had finally wandered off into another room, chasing each other with giggles and squeals, leaving the living room momentarily quiet. For the first time that afternoon, I allowed myself a breath, straightening my posture and brushing imaginary dust off my clothes. Just as I was about to settle back into organizing toys, he appeared beside me, unannounced but entirely unintrusive. His presence, calm and confident, immediately made the room feel smaller, more intimate, despite the distance between us. "Are they giving you trouble?" he asked casually, his voice low and steady, carrying the faintest hint of amusement. I laughed softly, a little embarrassed, shaking my head. "Not too much," I replied, though the truth was that they had been a whirlwind of energy. His eyes crinkled in that subtle way I'd already begun to notice, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. There was no judgment in his gaze, only curiosity, a quiet, observing attentiveness that made me self-conscious in a way I couldn't quite articulate. We began talking, first about the children, their routines, their little quirks that made them endlessly entertaining and sometimes frustrating. Yet as the conversation flowed, it naturally shifted to lighter, more personal topics. Hints of shared humor and understanding crept in, and I found myself laughing more freely than I had all afternoon. It was a strange, disarming feeling. He had a way of drawing me out, of making ordinary conversation feel layered with subtle tension and quiet intimacy. I noticed the way he leaned slightly forward when speaking, just enough to close the distance without touching, the way his gaze seemed to follow my every expression. It was both flattering and unsettling. I was hyper-aware of myself, how I shifted on the sofa, the tilt of my head, the way my fingers absent-mindedly fiddled with a piece of string from a toy. Every movement felt amplified under his watchful attention, and I realized, with a mix of embarrassment and intrigue, that he had a way of commanding focus without saying a word. Our conversation flowed effortlessly, yet beneath the casual words, a tension hummed, electric and unspoken. I found myself carefully choosing my words, aware that even a simple comment might be received with a subtle shift in his expression. There was a playful curiosity in his manner, as if he were quietly testing boundaries, seeing how much I might reveal without breaking my composure. And I, in turn, was drawn to him, aware of the pull that went far beyond the ordinary dynamic between a babysitter and a parent. For a brief moment, the room felt suspended in time. The children's laughter was now a distant background hum, and it seemed as though nothing existed beyond the two of us, two people drawn into a quiet orbit of mutual intrigue and subtle tension. I realized that even this short, private conversation had left an imprint on me, a sense of connection I hadn't anticipated, and a recognition that my afternoon of babysitting was far more complicated than I had imagined. By the time he excused himself to attend to other matters, I sat back, breathless in a way that had nothing to do with running after the children. The conversation lingered, the memory of his gaze and quiet presence settling into my thoughts. I had come to care for his children, but in this quiet, fleeting moment, I realized he was the one capturing my attention, stealing fragments of my focus, and leaving me unsettled in a way I could neither predict nor resist. The afternoon had carried a quiet rhythm, one of play, laughter, and small glimpses of connection, but then it shifted in a way I hadn't anticipated. I was bending over to pick up a stray toy from the carpet when I suddenly became aware of his presence closer than before. He was standing just behind me, casual in posture, yet there was a subtle tension in the air, a magnetic pull that made my chest tighten. I froze for a brief second, a toy still in hand, and realized that the ordinary act of bending over had suddenly become charged with an unexpected intimacy. He didn't say a word, just watched, his gaze calm and assessing, but there was a softness in it that made my heart flutter in ways I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't a loud or overt flirtation. There were no dramatic gestures, no sudden movement, but the subtlety was precisely what made it so compelling. The corner of his mouth lifted in a small, knowing smile, and the brief eye contact we shared sent an involuntary shiver down my spine. My usual composure wavered, replaced by a heightened awareness of every movement, every breath, every tiny detail about his presence. The children were momentarily distracted by a toy rolling across the floor, their laughter a gentle backdrop that contrasted sharply with the sudden intensity between us. I felt acutely aware of the professional boundary I was meant to maintain, yet in that instant, it seemed impossibly fragile. The ordinary routine of babysitting had transformed into a charged dance of glances, subtle gestures, and unspoken tension. He shifted slightly, moving closer under the pretense of picking up a toy himself, and I felt a heat rise to my cheeks. I tried to focus on straightening the scattered blocks, on maintaining a semblance of normalcy for the children, but my attention kept drifting to him. There was something intoxicating about the way he carried himself, confident, calm, and undeniably aware of the effect he had on me. Every small motion, every casual smile seemed designed to pull my attention away from my duties and towards him. In that brief, fleeting moment, I realized that the flirtation was as much about the tension as it was about any words or actions. It was in the pauses, the unspoken glances, the charged silence that stretched just long enough to make the atmosphere feel electric. I found myself laughing softly at one of the children's antics, feeling a mix of embarrassment and thrill as I noticed him watching me, his eyes following my movements with quiet amusement. By the time he stepped back and returned to his own tasks, the effect lingered. I was left hyper-aware, my pulse slightly elevated, my thoughts tangled between professionalism and the magnetic pull of his presence. The ordinary afternoon of babysitting had subtly transformed into something far more complex, where playful interaction with the children intertwined with the tension simmering between us. It was a moment that reminded me of how unpredictably someone can enter your space, not just physically, but emotionally, and unsettle your calm, your composure, and your focus. In that quiet, seemingly ordinary interaction, he had done exactly that, stirred something in me I wasn't ready to acknowledge, leaving me both aware and unervingly captivated.